Before we start tonight's topic, which is peoplehood, I wanted to just sort of over the week, something came up which I thought related to our discussion last week about Kaplan's view of God. So actually Gloria emailed this nice Dvar Torah, which is now out on the front, on the table in front here, and you can read the Dvar Torah, but it had a line in it which this Rabbi Shavit Aritzon, who teaches at the Ziegler School of Rabbinical Studies, and it says, God's very nature is radical freedom, a freedom that explodes into space and time, a freedom that liberates slaves, and a freedom that brings people to their promised home, which I thought was very poetic and moving and sort of a nice statement, which probably moves people, I imagine. But that's pure Kaplan. Just that Kaplan is a very bad writer, right? So he writes, God is the power that makes for freedom, but it means the same thing, right? So I thought I would point that out. That Kaplan, in his mode of writing, wants to be clear, like a lawyer. He doesn't want to be poetic, which I think drives us crazy, because most of us like poetry. He wants to be rational and analyze it, but it means the same thing. So I just thought I would point that kind of thing out. And the other thing is that URL, if people want to copy it down, or you can come later and I'll let you copy it, is an excellent, people know the CBC radio show Tapestry, which discusses religion. And this is an interview with one of Kaplan's students, Harold Kushner, the man who wrote When Bad Things Happen to Good People and several other books. And he wrote a book, something about how to overcome fear or something, and she interviews him about the book. But if you listen to it, again, it's 95% Reconstructionist Kaplan. I mean, he's got his own little angle, but you just listen to it and he'll tell you what Kaplan thinks, or what Reconstructionist or Kaplan thinks about God. Tonight we're talking about Kaplan's idea of Am Yisrael, peoplehood. We're going to talk about nationalism and peoplehood in general. Kaplan has ideas about these topics in general outside of what it means for Jews. We're going to talk about his ideas of Jewish peoplehood in particular, about his idea of ethical nationalism, which is a phrase that he invented, so it's sort of capitalized ethical nationalism. His program for Jewish life in the diaspora, he had some very specific ideas about how Jewish life in the Americas, or America in particular, but we can extrapolate to Canada, should be organized, and his views of Zionism. Kaplan was an early Zionist, but an unusual Zionist. First of all, for Kaplan, peoplehood is central. It really is, and when we organized the course, we couldn't decide what order to teach the classes in, so we did it God, peoplehood, religion, but that was sort of arbitrary about how we thought logically to teach it, not the importance in his worldview. In his worldview, peoplehood is the center. And we'll hopefully explain that as we go on. Peoplehood is the foundation on which the Jewish practices and beliefs are founded. If there is no people, there is no Judaism. It's an obvious insight, but it's a central insight to his viewpoint. He often said the Jewish religion exists to support the Jewish people, not the other way around. Traditionally, in a sort of an orthodox framework, the Jewish people exist to promote the Jewish religion. He says, no. The Jewish religion exists to help the Jewish people survive, to give them a good way of living and a good way of surviving over the generations. Kaplan is as much of a sociologist as he is a rabbi, which is an interesting thing. I mean, he worked in a rabbinic framework, but he's interested in sociology. He's interested in how to organize communities. He's a social theorist and maybe a bit of a, I don't know, like community worker or that kind of person. He had a lot of ideas about this, about how things should be organized. And he's just as much concerned with developing a national program as a religious program. Although the two are very connected in Kaplan's mind. I mean, religion and nationality go together in his worldview. So Kaplan and the national question. So this phrase, the national question, sounds awkward to us today. But this was a buzzword in the late 19th century and early 20th century. In the 19th century, most of the world was organized on multinational empires. Europe had the Habsburg Empire, it had the Russian Empire, the British Empire certainly contained many nations around the world. Perhaps, France was the only real nation state in the mid-19th century. And the whole idea of nationalism and what the place of nations was, and should states be organized around national boundaries? Should every nation have its own state? How could you figure out the proper political modus vivendi for nations? Were nations important? Should nations just fade away and everybody live in one big world of humanity? These were pressing questions, and maybe they still are today, but they were extremely pressing questions in the late 19th century and maybe the first 7 or 8 decades of the 20th century. I mean, think of this, obviously it all comes to a head in World War II, but that's just the sort of end process of that conflict. World War I was fought mostly from the American idea of Wilsonian nationalism, where President Wilson had this idea that as a result of World War I, every European nation would be allowed its own state, and this was a very progressive idea, self-determination for nations. We're going to break up these oppressive empires, and every little country would have its own, every little nation would have its own state. That doesn't quite work in Europe because there are so many small nations, and in fact, states were cobbled together, like Yugoslavia, which was a multinational state, Czechoslovakia, which is a multinational state, and of course, every state which had Jews in it, which didn't quite fit. So Germany was a multinational state because it had a significant Jewish minority. Poland had a 10 or 12% Jewish minority. So Jews didn't quite fit into these things either. So the whole idea of the national question was a burning issue in the turn of the 20th century, when Kaplan was growing up, the early 20th century, and the Jewish position in this national question was a very burning issue as well. And you had a whole spectrum of ideas, and people on the far left, communists, believed that nations would fade away, and that anybody who was loyal to their nation was, anti-revolutionary. And this meant Jews or Germans or French. It was just silly. You should be loyal to your class. On the other hand, you had the fascists who believed that nationalism was the center of everything, blood and soil. So these issues didn't just pop up at World War II. They'd been brewing for 100 years before that. Kaplan was 16 at the time of the first Zionist Congress. So he grew up with Zionism. These were all new ideas and exciting ideas for him. But he was heavily influenced by Ahad Ha'am, who we'll talk about a little more later on, who is today sort of a forgotten figure, but whose idea was cultural Zionism. That the important point about Zionism was not the state, but the Jewish culture, which of course resonated with Kaplan, and hopefully we can see how that works out. A little interesting quirk, he was ordained by Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Reines. Anyone been in Tel Aviv and been on Reines Street? He was the founder of the Mizrahi movement, the religious Zionists. Okay? And he was a friend of Kaplan's father, and nobody was ordaining Orthodox rabbis in America in the early 1900s, I think. So in 1903 or 4 or 5, he takes a trip to Europe. His father arranges that his friend will give him a test and ordain him as a rabbi. Just as a curiosity, it's one of the only religious Zionists. There weren't very many religious Zionists in 1900-something. Mizrahi was a very small faction. His first published article in 1908 is called Judaism and Nationality in a journal called the Menorah Journal, and it was popular in New York, an intellectual journal. And his last book, published in 1970, is The Religion of Ethical Nationhood. So this idea of nationality and nationhood, ethical nationhood, the Jews' position in the family of nations, what Jewish nationalism means, is really a central theme that runs from his youth to his old age. It's an overarching theme. He's trying to figure out how Jews should fit into this idea of nationhood. And he's obsessed with making sure that the Jews are an exemplary nation. He understands that nations can cut both ways. He thinks they can be good things and they can be bad things. He wants Jews to be a good, exemplary model nation. At the same time as he's growing up, America is struggling to define itself. 1881 is the beginning of really mass immigration into America, which is shut off after, I think 1920 or 21, they basically shut immigration after 40 years of mass immigration. And they shut it off because America is like, can't figure out what it wants to do with itself. It can't figure out if it wants to be an American nation and have this melting pot where everybody becomes American and more or less the same, or whether it's going to allow some sort of multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-something, what we would call multiculturalism today, but the word hadn't been invented then. And it's struggling with that. So these ideas are happening in America too, and he's very concerned with how this affects the Jews and what this means in general for the world. Later in his life, he's already in his 40s and 50s, in the 20s and 30s, the world is turning to fascism, and in America to nativism. We get this reaction to the immigration. We get this very strong nativism in America, basically rejecting anyone who's like not born in America and doesn't become American. Anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anti-black, anti-anybody who's not sort of waspy. And he sees that in America. And of course there's fascism in Europe, which is against anybody who's not of your nation. So all this is sort of nationalism going awry in his view. Post-World War II, he witnesses the Cold War, which he viewed with much alarm, and he was very worried about nuclear war. He was a big campaigner against nuclear arms. And again, he sees this as nationalism sort of going awry and a very dangerous phenomenon. And he witnesses the birth of Israel, which he was a Zionist, and I'm sure he was very happy about the birth of Israel, but he soon starts to worry about Jewish chauvinism and what he calls statism, the association of Judaism with the state of Israel. And his last book, as I said, The Religion of Ethical Nationhood, published in 1970, he was 88 years old when he wrote that. Last time I said there were 4 points. If you remember them, you can remember the whole lecture. So here it's the whole lecture on one foot. The salvation of the individual can only be found in the group. Kaplan believes that nations exist or should exist because people are group animals, are socially oriented. And the nation is, just like the family is a natural unit, the nation is a natural unit of some size. And people need these groups and units to live within. They can't live atomically. A civilization, and here I use a civilization interchangeably with a people or a nation, a civilization only fulfills its function when the people that live by it achieve life abundant or salvation. So again, he uses funny words, salvation, he means fulfillment, personal fulfillment. So the purpose of the nation, or the purpose of the national civilization, is to improve the lives of the individuals that live in it. Okay? It's not for the glory of the nation as an abstract thing. It's a reciprocal relationship. The people support the nation support the people with a small p. Even if the individual is to be trained for world citizenship, he must begin as a member of the particular people into which he was born. So this is an argument against sort of communist universalism. He thinks that's too hard for people. People have to start with a smaller units. You start with your family, you work up to your immediate community, you work up to your nation, or nations, as we shall see. You might belong to more than one nation, and then you sort of work up to a loyalty to all of humanity, and it sort of goes in concentric circles. Jewish peoplehood is not a political category, but a moral and spiritual category. And here he's arguing against political Zionism, such as Herzl and Ben-Gurion. He thinks that, yes, there's a place for a Jewish state, but Judaism is not synonymous with a state. It's not a political movement. It's a moral and spiritual category. And lastly, I've come to realize that it would be a mistake to retain the concept of chosen people, even in its interpretation in this book. And he's referring to Judaism as a civilization, where he supported the idea of Jewish people and tried to give it a certain spin. And by 1957, in the preface to the 1957 edition, he's completely rejected it. He said it was a dangerous concept. Jews don't understand it. As soon as you open the door to that, we become chauvinistic, and therefore we have to kill that idea. He's very concerned with chauvinism. He thought he could spin it and reinterpret it, but he, 20-something years after the book appeared, he said, no, that was a mistake. We just have to kill it. And it's interesting that that's in the 50s, partly as a reaction to the Holocaust and partly as a reaction to the birth of the State of Israel, which he saw as increasing chauvinism in the Jewish community. Kaplan came eventually to use the word people instead of nation. Peoplehood instead of nationhood. In the 30s, he was very comfortable using the word nation. by the 50s, he had switched to peoplehood, and he sort of invented the term. I mean, peoplehood is not necessarily the most common word today, but he invented that term to the extent that now it's very in vogue among Jewish circles, certainly, to talk about the Jewish people and peoplehood. No one used that term before Kaplan did in the 50s. It was a Jewish nation. Yisrael was translated into English as the Jewish nation. And he invented this term, and he invented it for a reason, because he thought nation and nationhood had become tainted. And they'd become tainted partly because of the rise of political Zionism, and partly in general because of everything that happened in the 40s around nationalism. So the concept of nationhood as applied to the Jews has become too closely identified with statehood, so he's being quite explicit here, and is therefore in need of being replaced by the concept of peoplehood. And again, that's in the 1957 preface to the Judaism of the Civilization. A people shares a history. It shares sancta, and if you remember from sancta, by sancta he means things that you are emotionally attached to. For the Americans, it's the American flag and the Washington Monument. For Jews, it's the Torah scroll and the State of Israel and the Wailing Wall, and and Shabbat. These are sancta, things that you are emotionally attached to, perhaps irrationally, but they're very important to the people as a whole, because they create a common bond and a common message. So we have a common history, shared sancta, a shared culture, shared concerns, shared institutions, and in some level a shared fate. That's what unites a people. But a people does not need, in Kaplan's view, a common set of values. It's nice if they can have them. They have overlapping values, but there are differentiations of values within a people. People will disagree among values, and they don't need an ethnic state. So this idea of not needing common values, I think, is very challenging. This is his point, that the community needs to be a community even if we don't agree. And we need to embrace pluralism. And the quote on the side is sort of, I think, instructive. The important point to remember is that survival of Jewish life is by no means dependent on the unity among Jews or uniformity in Judaism. What a noted sociologist has said of the family applies with equal truth to the Jewish people. The family does not depend for its survival on harmonious relations of its members. The family lives as long as interaction is taking place and only dies when it ceases. So the uncle who you don't like, as long as you see him on Passover and yell at him, he's still part of the family. When he stops coming over or you stop inviting him, that's when the family starts falling apart. And that's what he's extrapolating to Jews in general. He sees that Jews will not always agree, but as long as we feel that we have something to fight over, or some commonality that we share, enough that we're going to get together on occasion and interact, that's what the important thing is. That will keep the Jewish people alive. And the disagreement is a healthy disagreement, because it will lead to everyone improving their ideas, and that's sort of a healthy competition which will improve things. Why do we need peoplehood? So again, the salvation of the individual can only be found in the group. People are social animals. Even if the individual is to be trained for world citizenship, he must begin as a member of the particular people into which he was born. You can't identify with undifferentiated humanity. I think this is perhaps a controversial view. I certainly know a lot of leftists who think you can. And I'm not sure this is true myself, but certainly this was his view, that you can't identify with undifferentiated humanity. And even if you could, the path to that identification leads through in stages, identifying first with family, and then with your nation, and then with everybody. So even if it is possible to ultimately be a true universalist, the way you learn that is in stages, one of which passes through your own people and your own culture. When we study the quest for salvation, we note that salvation presupposes a community which treats individuals as so organic a part of itself that in promoting his life, the individual's life, it is aware that it is promoting its own. So again, to unpack that statement, the community, if the community makes you a better person, it should be proud of itself. That is the goal of the community. The goal of the community is to help its individual members. It's not some abstract notion to take an extreme, sort of from a fascist view that we're going to build great architecture and leave ruins for 1,000 years. I mean, I don't know if people know that Hitler had architects design buildings with a view, how will it look in 1,000 years when they discover the ruins? I mean, that was sort of the megalomania of the great German nation, and that was typical of sort of the fascist worldview. And he's saying exactly the opposite. The purpose of the nation is to improve the lives of its individual people, and it should be happy when it does that. So, to take the opposite example, in Canada, we're sort of proud of healthcare. He would have approved. That's the purpose of the nation, just, helping people. It's not the flag or, something glorious like that. It's the very practical things of helping individual people. That's the purpose of the nation. How does he view peoplehood, or how should it work? Again, the same idea. Civilization only fulfills its function when the people that lives by it achieves life abundant or salvation. Second quote, paradoxical as it seems, if a nation wishes to survive, it must not make survival itself its supreme objective, but rather aim at achieving the highest intellectual, aesthetic, and social good. That alone makes a nation's survival important to its individual members. I think that's a very good insight, that yes, you want to survive. Yes, every nation wants to survive and grow. But if you obsess about that, if you make that the educational point, and again, remember, he's a rabbi teaching Jews and trying to reach out to them. If you get up in the pulpit and say, be Jewish because otherwise the Jewish people will fall apart. Don't intermarry, otherwise the Jewish people, there will be no more Jewish people. He says that doesn't move anybody. That's not the right way to approach it. Tell people, be Jewish because we have a great intellectual tradition, and here it is. Or be Jewish because we have a great aesthetic Jewish tradition, because you like Jewish music or Jewish art. Be Jewish because Judaism promotes a social good. That's why you should be Jewish, so to make it very practical. So that's what he's trying to say in that kind of a sentence, although he's saying it in general about all nations, not just Jews. What gives a people its character? Character is essentially the feeling of holiness which it generates in all who are part of it. That feeling presupposes in all of them an awareness of a dedication to some transcendental ideal. So here we see Kaplan, in a sense, replacing God with the nation. I may be going a little bit too far here, but that's sort of what he's doing. He's saying everyone wants to feel, what does transcendental mean? It means it's a feeling of sort of being uplifted, being part of something greater than yourself, right? That's what really transcendental means. So everybody wants to feel part of something greater than themselves. No one wants to feel like an isolated human being living in a, totally isolated. You want to feel that you're part of something bigger, and maybe bigger both in space and in time, that somehow you'll live on after death, that you are identified with something good and thing. And he's saying that can be the nation. If the nation has good ideals and you are part of the nation, then you will feel that by identifying with the nation. But it takes two things. A, that the nation has good ideals, or ideals that you identify with, that you think are good, and that you are made to feel part of that nation. So he's shifting what people usually, traditional Judaism, try to do through identifying with God. You're identifying with God, which is the ultimate transcendental thing, right, to the nation, which lives beyond you in time and in space. And if you identify with that, you can get that mystical high, is what he's saying. As a civilization, Judaism possesses the prerogative of being an end in itself. So Judaism is an end in itself, as is any nation. It just has the right to live because it is. In a world of competitive values, it is an honorable thing to seek a rationale for the particular values that one lives by. And for Jews, values are especially competitive. Yet when the tendency is carried to excess, Judaism becomes a complex rather than a way of life. So this is the critique of Woody Allen, right? Why am I this way? Am I a good person? Am I not a good person? So he's saying, something, yes, it's natural to want, this is the counterbalance to the previous quote, which is we should all be have transcendent ideals. He's not an extremist. He always finds the middle ground. He's saying, on the other hand, you can just be because you are. You don't have to be perfect. It's better to be perfect, but it's also okay just to be. On the other hand, again, to counter that quote, both of these are from the same book, and they're like 70 pages apart. To assume that it is possible for the Jews to maintain their nationhood at the present time without believing that there is something in it of universal significance is to reckon without human nature. Jewish nationalists who contend that the sense of nationhood requires no justification in any universal purpose are correct only as far as the challenging outsider is concerned. So saying Jews can live just because we're Jews and we don't need to be better than anybody else, so that's a good answer for the Goyim. But internally, that's not a good answer, because no one will want to be Jewish if there isn't something good and uplifting and universal about it. Right? If Judaism is just about gefilte fish, well, there are other good foods in the world, right? So it has to be about something universal, peace, brotherhood, justice, those kind of things, in order to motivate people to want to be part of it. It's a good argument to the outside world to say, why are you demanding from us to be better than anybody else? But it's not a good argument internally for ourselves. So Kaplan did believe that the Jewish people were somewhat special. Usually he wants to say that we're not, but he does have some points where he says we are. So the Jewish people is special in that almost all of its sancta and its historical cultural production has been focused around religious ideals. This is the central way Judaism has produced itself. Rome produced itself militarily and through architecture and law and roads. Other nations have focused on other things, or maybe they have a more balanced worldview. Jews have been obsessed with religious ideas, which means ideas about the ultimate nature of meaning and ethics and morality. That's what religion is. So the first quote, "The people of Israel, however, did not merely deify their patriotism." So he says we did deify our patriotism. We turned our patriotism into like God ordained, God picked us. But in addition, subordinates it to a divinity of cosmic proportions. They thereby subordinated it to principles which are coextensive with the cosmos, the principle of law and order and responsibility to and for mankind. So Jews historically have identified ourselves with these universal principles. And he said that's somewhat unique. In the case of the Jewish people, the transcendent ideal that holds it together, as articulated in the Jewish tradition, has found a cosmic formulation in its unique idea of God, who shows himself holy through righteousness, and also a humanist formulation in its vision of a messianic age. So again, he's saying, on the one hand, we have this cosmic or traditional religious formulation. We identify with God who is righteous, God, this transcendental God who is righteous. But we also have this, what he views as a humanistic formulation of the messianic age, of perfection on earth. We aren't just tied to this idea of perfection in heaven. We're tied to this idea of perfection on earth. And finally, our faith in God is necessarily challenged by the evils that we recognize as existing in the world in which we live. It is only when we look back upon the history of mankind, and more specifically on the history of our people, that we recognize how we have again and again been redeemed from perilous situations and encouraged in the belief in spiritual progress. So that's a remarkable quote. He's saying, if we look at the actual world, it's easy to get depressed. There's evil in the world. It's not such a nice world, right? And that can challenge your faith in God or in goodness or whatever. And he says, how do we overcome that? We look at the history of the Jewish people. Now, usually, we've been, at least I was brought up to, the history of the Jewish people is one tragedy after another. But that's not how Kaplan sees it. He says, after every tragedy, we were saved. And the fact that we were saved and we're still here is a reason for optimism. Yes, there are bad things happen. Yes, crises happen, but we have survived. And so he takes out of the Passover story not the oppression, but the part of that thing that Shebechol dor vador amdu aleinu l'chalotenu. In every generation, they came up to destroy us, which is the depressing part. But he doesn't look at that. He looks at the second half of the sentence, which is, but the Holy One, blessed be He, saved us. And he says that he views that as a sign of hope. And therefore, we can be hopeful about the world. And looking at our national history with a correct viewpoint will give us that hope. So these are all special things about the Jewish people that have to do with our religion, that should make us optimistic, should make us associate with righteousness, with the Messianic age, and with principles of law and order. He's very big on law, on righteousness through law. But though the Jewish people is special, it is not chosen. He's emphatic about that and gets more emphatic about it as he gets older. He explicitly rejects the concept of the chosen people because, first of all, if God is not a personality, and we talked about that last week, how can he choose? Right? God isn't a conscious being that can go, you. It's just, God is just this sort of force in the universe. If the Jewish religious truths are not revealed, and he doesn't believe in revelation, then they are accessible to all people. We just figured them out. If we can figure them out, so can other people. And many have figured them out. We're not the only people to come up with the idea of law and justice and things like that. Ethical nationalism, and again we'll sort of talk about it a little bit more later on, demands eschewing all forms of chauvinism and claims of unique privilege. One nation can't claim to be better than the other, or that's going to lead to war. Jewish chauvinism has been growing, not shrinking, with the rise of Jewish nationalism and after the Holocaust. This is something that sort of surprised him. He thought it would fade away, and therefore he gets stronger in his rejection of chosenism. And claims of chosenness increase disharmony and anti-Semitism. This is an external argument. The very fact that we say we're chosen pisses off the Goyim and increases anti-Semitism. So that's sort of an external argument. So for all these reasons, he rejects chosenness, and he thinks we shouldn't teach it in any form. But instead of chosenness, he substitutes the idea of vocation. And Kaplan prefers the idea of vocation because it implies something the Jewish people chooses. So we choose to act righteously. We choose to act charitably. We choose to act whatever, in whatever way. That's what a vocation is. It implies something that requires skill and effort, so it doesn't come naturally. It's not something that God gave us. We have to work at this, right, both in terms of effort and in terms of skill. So we have some skill because we have some history about thinking about it and writing about it. We have a big tradition about this, but it still requires effort. But also it implies something that can be shared. Many people can have the same or similar vocation, because it's not a word that privileges one group over another. Many people can be potters, so many people can be chosen, if you wish, or strive to be God's agents on earth. The Jewish people's vocation is to honor the God of righteousness, to exemplify ethical nationalism, and to bring forth the kingdom of God on earth. So that's his idea of what our vocation, our mission statement is or should be. So let's unpack that a bit. To honor the God of righteousness, again, he believes that there is a God of righteousness. There is an underlying force that moves towards righteousness in the world, and we need to acknowledge that and to honor it and say we're on its side. To exemplify ethical nationalism, we need to be the best nation we can possibly be. This is Or L'Goyim, in a sense, to be an example, but again, because we want to be. And to bring forth the kingdom of God on earth, well, you know, make the world a better place. Tikkun Olam. Okay, so let's talk about the idea of ethical nationalism, which is, again, a category for Kaplan. So again, his last book was The Religion of Ethical Nationhood, which he wrote at age 87, or was published when he was 88, so he probably wrote it when he was 86 or 80-something. I'll just read you from sort of the flyleaf here. This book promulgates the idea of ethical nationhood as the only means, and again, it's 1970 when it was published. This book promulgates the idea of ethical nationhood as the only means of forestalling the doom that threatens human and world survival, says Mordeccai Kaplan in the preface to Religion of Ethical Nationhood. As now constituted, sovereign nations cannot cope with the dangers of overpopulation, depletion of natural resources, and nuclear warfare. Mankind's only hope lies in the rise of a spiritual leadership devoted to the eradication of these man-made evils. So, again, he doesn't quite get to global warming, because that was before his time, but he does talk about natural resources. So, basically, overpopulation, depletion of the environment, and nuclear warfare. And he believes that nations as constituted in 1970 can't cope with this. We need some transnational structure, some structure and ideas that go beyond nations to deal with all these problems. He has this idea here: without free religion to curb and direct modern nationalism, humanity will be re-barbarized. He has perhaps maybe a overly romantic view of religion, and we can view, but he does preface with the word free religion, which means he means his idea of religion. And what he's really saying, without spiritual values, that nations that don't have spiritual values will barbarize the world. If nations act in their self-interest, if that is their motivating way of acting, we're in big trouble. I mean, again, in the Second World War, nations acted in their self-interest. No one talked, I mean, maybe they talked a little bit about high ideals, but they very much acted in their self-interest. In the middle of the Cold War, he viewed America as acting in its self-interest and Russia acting in its self-interest and not thinking about the larger world. And he thought, and not having spiritual values at their core, but having economic and materialistic values at their core. So what does he mean by ethical nationalism? He's trying to break, again, this maybe dates back to his pre-World War I days, although he didn't formulate this until, well, he formulated some of this in the 30s already. He's trying to break the identification of nation and states. He thinks that's a very dangerous linkage. He says the idea of the nation-state doesn't work and it's dangerous. Nation-states will oppress minority groups, and nation-states will feel self-righteous because they're only concerned about their in-group, not anybody outside their borders. But he does think that nations are important. So he's trying to think, how can nations be organized across state boundaries? And he thinks that all states should be multinational and all peoples multi-state. So just like the Jews live in many countries around the world, the Jews are a multi-state people. And just like when Jews live in Poland or the United States, that country has multiple peoples in it, Jews plus other kinds of peoples. He thinks that's a model, it's actually a good model and a model for the world. Multiculturalism is good for all cultures, and we have nothing to fear from other cultures. He doesn't want anybody, Jews included, to be insular. We can actually learn from the other cultures we live in, and the Czechs can learn from the Slovaks, and the Slovaks can learn from the Czechs. And he would have been disappointed that Czechoslovakia broke up. He would have wanted them to live together. He would be against Quebec separatism. He would say, we can learn from the French Canadians, and the French Canadians can learn from the English Canadians, and we should figure out how to live in one country. In a multinational world, tolerance for other people is in the interest of all states and all people. And again, that's the reason not to have nation states, which he thought built intolerance. In a multinational world, peace and cooperation is in the interest of all states and all people. And scattered multi-state peoples, like the Jews, can be a force for internationalism and world peace. He believed that people like the Jews, and he gives some other examples as well, because they live in many places around the world, are less likely to be super chauvinistic about their country. They're less likely to want to go to war against other countries where there are Jews. They're going to be more understanding of the other countries because they've got a cousin or a second cousin or somebody in that other country that they know and correspond to. And they build these cross-state boundaries. And he believes that Jews should work to have America become more multinational, to be more tolerant of all sorts of minority groups. And interestingly enough, he goes on at quite some length about how he thinks the Catholics will be the allies of the Jews in this, because he thinks the Catholics, again, writing in the 30s, are unassimilatable in America. They're not going to become just like the Protestant Americans. They're different. They have this whole strong cultural base built around their ethnicity, but also the Catholic Church. And he very much admires the Catholics in terms of the way, again, living in New York City, in the way they organize their communities. The Catholics had a separate education system. They had, the churches had gymnasiums in them and played basketball, something that he thought synagogues should have. They built a whole life around the Catholic community, and he thought that was actually a good thing to do, and we could learn something from them. And he also thought they would be allies in resisting the American melting pot, and I think he was correct to a certain extent. Certainly, if you look at America today and look at Latinos in America today, and there's a language issue in addition to a religious issue there, they are unassimilatable. They are the big challenge facing the United States and forcing it to become a multicultural society, something Kaplan would have approved of, I think. States should not be absolutely sovereign. Again, writing in the 30s and 40s and 50s, these were radical ideas. These were not, certainly in the States today, a lot of people would disagree with this. Maybe in Canada too, I don't know. They should subject themselves to moral law and to the institutions of international law and government. So he's a big supporter of the League of Nations and later on the United Nations. And he would say, yes, we should give up our sovereignty to things like the International Criminal Court, to the United Nations. Nations should not be completely sovereign. We need to build world government. We need to work up to that, something like that. And nations should subordinate their narrow interests to the interests of mankind. So when it comes to issues like global warming, Yes, it might be bad for Canada to sign a global warming treaty, but Kaplan says we should do it anyways, because our narrow interest in making money off the oil is small change against the long-term interest of mankind in stopping climate change. And he would just make that, you say, just forget it. You know, it's immoral to talk about self-interest of a country when it's in conflict with the larger interest of mankind. Nations, as opposed to states, only succeed when they earn voluntary loyalty of their members and when they serve their interests. So states can coerce people, nations can't. The Jewish people can't coerce anybody. The state of Israel can, the state of Canada can, but the Jewish people can't coerce you. They can't force you to do anything. They can't fine you. They can't send you to jail. They don't have a police force. And therefore, because they need to get people to join voluntarily, they should work to provide justice, freedom, and equality and other social goods that their members need. So a people is going to be motivated to provide good things to its members because that's the only way it can retain membership. So he thinks. So the Jewish community in Toronto, if it wants to retain membership, needs to provide good things, cultural things and physical things. So he believes. Nations, as opposed to states, will take the long view. The Jewish people, or the British people, or the English people, right, think of themselves as having this long history, both going back in time and going into the future. You know, on the other hand, the United Kingdom versus England versus some other configuration, I mean, Scotland might secede recently, these are temporary structures which, and anyway, states always take the short-term view because they have to have elections and the leaders are always worried about the short-term things. Whereas national leaders are caught up in this big, long view and will take the long view, which he thinks is a good thing. So he understood that nations could be good or bad. He wasn't naive about that. He just was arguing for this ethical nationalism. So there are the ready criteria for judging when nationalism is a blessing and when it is a curse. If the national sentiment is such as to furnish the majority of the population with reasons for discriminating against any minority, then it is undoubtedly a menace, not only to the particular group victimized, but to civilization in general. So if you don't treat your minorities right, good, you're a bad nation, or a dangerous nation. No nation can achieve the full stature of its nationhood except in a world in which nations as well as individuals subject themselves to moral law. So again, nations should voluntarily subject themselves to moral law and not deal with self-interest. A nation that just wants to win wars or views that as the highest good is a bad nation. A nation that subjects itself to moral law and says, no, we want to increase justice or equality or other good things is a good nation. When, therefore, we expect nationhood to exert a spiritual influence, it is only because we envision a United States of the world, and here he's talking about world government in the 30s, which shall exercise the same authority over each of its constituent states as each nation now exercises over the individuals and internal groups within its borders. It is taken for granted that so long as anarchy prevails within a nation, the individual cannot be expected to lead a normal life. It is likewise to be understood that so long as anarchy prevails among nations in their relation to one another, the good that lies dormant in nationhood cannot come to fruition. A civitas maximus may seem utopian, but unless it be brought within the sphere of reality, it will not be long before the human race will destroy itself. Again, nations need to cooperate, and he wants it to be under law. He wants the United Nations or a League of Nations in his state to be strong and nations to voluntarily submit to it, and things like that. These quotes are more on sort of multiculturalism, okay, his ideas of multi-states living together, and I think they're actually very prescient. The only group category that can render the Western Jews' position tenable is one that recognizes the moral and spiritual right to cultural hyphenism. Jewish Americans. Not just Jewish Americans, Indo-Canadians, whatever. Ukrainian Canadians, whatever. He thinks that's a good thing, and that's the way the world should be organized. And in any case, that's the only way Jews can survive. So for our self-interest, we should argue for that. And it is not for Jews alone that such a category should be created. So we understand that it's not for Jews. That other people will benefit from this as well. Indeed, the only way out of the present melange of historical civilizations and modern nations is to sanction living in more than one civilization. It is the inevitable lot of modern man. So the phrase that we like to use, living in two civilizations, is not something that he thought was only for Jews. He thought this was for everybody. This is a lot of modern man. He's looking at Europe, and and he's saying the nations don't fit the state borders. So what are we going to do? Start carving up the national borders in this weird patchwork quilt? You can't do it in Europe. The people are too intertwined. And of course, people have tried, and it's just led to ethnic cleansing. We push people out so they'll fit into borders, right? And he says, no, if we recognize hyphenism, then you could have a Croat Yugoslavian and a Serb Yugoslavian and a Bosnian Yugoslavian, and you wouldn't have to have 3 different states and pushing people out because they don't quite live where they should live, right? And that's what he means by that quote. True democracy cannot merely mean the rule of the majority. It must provide equally for the rights of the minority. Democratic constitutions have generally recognized certain rights of the individual which are inalienable and which not even the state, as expressing the will of the majority, is allowed to override. But modern nations, even when they purport to be democratic, have not given sufficient recognition to the rights of minority groups to express themselves. They continue to thwart minority self-expression and self-determination. So he's thinking we should guarantee minority rights in the constitution of all states. Minority national rights are essential because nations have a right to live, and nations can never be coterminous with states, and therefore you need to allow your minority nations room to grow and give them recognition and let them teach in their own language and whatever else they need to thrive. And those rights should be guaranteed. And he thinks that's just as democratic as the idea of allowing individuals certain freedoms that the state can't abrogate. The present metamorphosis which the Jewish people is undergoing is emerging as a measure to which nations will have to, as a measure to which I guess all nations will have to resort if they are to retain a hold on the populations which are forced to find Lebensraum, an unfortunate choice of words, outside the mother country. Diaspora will before long become a common phenomenon with many peoples of the world. So he's anticipating mass migration, which is, again, writing in the 30s, which had already happened, but he's anticipating, if you think about Indians today, Indians live all over the world. And he's saying this is just going to happen more and more and more, and as people migrate. And people are still going to want that emotional and national tie to Indianism, whatever that is, to Indian culture, and that's okay and good. And Jews are at the forefront of that. We've been doing that for thousands of years. Organizing a people without a state. Sort of an aside on this, I'm reminded that the Dalai Lama, have people ever read the book, The Jew and the Lotus? So the key of that book, the reason it exists, is the Dalai Lama comes to talk to a bunch of rabbis and says, how do you keep a nation alive for 2,000 years without a state? Because he thinks that maybe the Tibetans will never get their state back. And he's thinking, how do you keep that alive with the Tibetan diaspora and the Tibetan homeland is occupied and yada, 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 yada. So again, Kaplan is anticipating those kind of problems for everybody, not just for Jews. And so he has a program for the diaspora. Of course, he lives in the diaspora. He lives in America. And he has a lot of interesting ideas. Some of these ideas were radical in his day, but in fact have been adopted. So when I say them, you'll say, well, so what's so big deal about that? But life wasn't like this in the 20s and 30s when he first started writing. So first of all, we are nothing if we are not a community of caring. Again, the same idea. The nation or the community has to serve the individual members. If we don't care for our members, there's no point. And it won't succeed because the members won't feel anything back from the group. The Jewish community, therefore, must meet the real needs of its individual members, both physical and spiritual. So ideas like Jewish family and child service, Jewish vocational agencies, these were not always there. Kaplan was actually brought to Canada, to Toronto in the 20s, to consult with the Canadian Jewish Congress when it was forming, because they liked his ideas and they wanted his feedback on how to organize things, how Jews should create networks of care and community centers and organize the community. So to a certain extent, perhaps more so 20 years ago, because I think we've gone backwards in Canada in the last 20 years, but the way maybe Canada was organized 20 years ago was very much in the Kaplanian mold, and to a certain extent we still are. Toronto is an unusual Jewish community. We don't necessarily appreciate it. It's a big community where there is a lot of social institutions organized not on sectarian lines. That's not the way it is in Birmingham, Alabama, or it might be true in New York City as well, but it's not true in smaller communities in the United States. The Jewish community must be united and act as a unit. Again, this idea of unity despite differences of theology or ritual or things like that. He wanted to end factionalism. In his day, everything was organized around synagogues, or pretty much anything, and therefore the different synagogues didn't talk to each other. There weren't these strong community organizations. They existed, but not to a very strong extent. Develop common programs and agendas for the whole community. Things like the Toronto Jewish Film Festival. He would have thought that was great. Things like Jewish day schools funded by the community and not affiliated with a synagogue movement. He would have thought that was great. Again, these didn't exist in the 20s and 30s. To include all Jews, wall-to-wall coalition, nobody's outside the community. To embrace pluralism within the community, so to tolerate different ideas and to embrace it, to think that's actually a good thing, because that pluralism will lead to ferment and discussion, and we will learn from each other, and no one has a lock on the truth. To embrace democracy within the community. He was very much against the rule of the rich, which unfortunately we still have in the Jewish community. The big givers run things. That's a sad truth. He had this idea that everyone would contribute, and if you contributed a minimum amount, you were a member of the community, so you had to pay your shekel or whatever, and you would vote. The Jewish masses would vote for the head of the UJA Federation and would vote for the head of all the Jewish institutions. The head of the Jewish Community Center would be elected by the Jewish community as a whole. And he believed in democracy for many reasons. A, because he believed in democracy as a value, but again, he believed that the ferment and the debate would engage people and would make them more attached to the community. That if you're fed everything from the top down, you're less engaged. If you're asked, well, what do you think? And you have to make a choice between this director of the JCC with this vision and this director with that, well, you'll be more involved in the whole process. He believed that we should have a formal organizational structure and membership. So again, there should be something called the Jewish community with a capital C, and people should belong to it. And there'd be sort of a minimal dues that you had to pay. I mean, something cheap that almost everyone could afford, or everyone could afford. And you got a little card, and a member of the Jewish community. I mean, some of this sounds odd today, but this was his vision of it. And he wanted to encourage the interaction of Jews at all levels and in multiple venues. So rich Jews should mingle with poor Jews, and there should be multiple venues to. One of his critiques of synagogues in his day was that not only were they organized around religious streams like Orthodox, but they were all also organized, and he uses the word class lines. He's not afraid to use the word class. He grows up in the 30s, that's a popular word. He says there are rich synagogues and poor synagogues, and therefore those two kind of Jews don't meet. If they were all owned, if the synagogues were owned by the community, we wouldn't have that. People would go, everyone would be allowed to go to any synagogue. The community would decide we need synagogues in these neighborhoods, and would build a single synagogue, and people would go there because it's the closest synagogue, and you wouldn't be denied entry, and it would be a mixture of whoever was there. Again, maybe a little utopian since rich people live in rich neighborhoods and poor, but nevertheless, he thought that this class division among Jews was a very bad thing. He had this idea of the Beit Am, which is something between a community center and a synagogue. Beit Am means the house of the people in Hebrew. So not a Beit Knesset, but a Beit Am, the people's house. And something between a community center and a synagogue. And first of all, again, it's funded by the community, the capital C community, not by the people who go there, but by the whole community. And it would contain multiple prayer groups, sports and cultural facilities, community aid offices, and schools. So something like a JCC, perhaps, in its way it would look. But you would also go there to pray. And of course, not everyone agrees on how to pray, so it would have 3 or 4 minyanim. It would have a Reform minyan, and a Conservative minyan, and an Orthodox minyan, and a Reconstructionist minyan. As many as were necessary. It would provide space for different Jews to pray. But after prayer, they could all get together and go to a lecture at the same facility. He had this vision he writes at some point, this vision of the sort of perfect Shabbat. You'd come in the morning to pray. Everyone would go to their different prayer groups. Then after prayer, the adults would go together to some adult education lecture, while the teenagers went and played basketball, and the little kids had daycare, and then there'd be a meal, and you sort of hang around this building all day Shabbat with different activities for different people, and that would be community Shabbat with different things for different age groups going on there. It would include the school would be located there, the office of the Jewish family and child would be located there. It would sort of be a true community center, and people would come there for various things during the week and on Shabbat. He was a very strong advocate of lay programs and lay leadership, even though he was a rabbi and taught in a rabbinical school. Again, he didn't think that religion was necessarily the most important part of Judaism. He said it was a necessary part, but not the only part, and maybe not even the most important part. Maybe it was the most important part, but maybe not. It was certainly just one facet, and you needed lay leadership and lay programs. He says most Jews will not regularly attend prayer services. They're just not interested. Right? So the synagogue and all his Reconstructionist prayer books, he admits, are for the people who like that stuff. Because some people just won't like that stuff, and we still need, and the majority won't like that stuff, and we still need to give them spiritual sustenance, however we give spiritual sustenance, through art, lectures, education, other things, just community events, and physical sustenance. We need to help them if they're unemployed. We need to teach their children. We need to do those kind of things. Believe in a rich cultural life. So again, the synagogue or the Beit should have art, music, drama, films, literature, political lectures, Hebrew literature. All these things should take place in this Beit or synagogue/community center type of thing. And the Jewish community needs a rich cultural life to interest its people, and that's the reciprocal relation between the Jewish people and its culture. The culture interests the people, and the people feed the culture and create new culture, and that's the way a healthy community lives, and so we need to promote that. He believes, as opposed to many Zionists of his time, that the diaspora is both inevitable and good for the Jewish people. We are never all going back to Israel, according to Kaplan, and that's good, and we should just get used to it. You know, stop fooling ourselves. So therefore, Jews will live in two civilizations, certainly in the diaspora, and probably even in Israel. Living in two civilizations enriches both civilizations and the individuals who partake. So Americans learn from Jews, Jews learn from Americans, that kind of thing. Diasporas and multiculturalism is the wave of the future we talked about before. It will lead to more human understanding and more cooperation and less war. The more we mingle with people not like ourselves, the more tolerance there will be, and the more less war there will be. He's against ghetto culture. He certainly would be against the Hasidic idea of isolating yourself from non-Jews. But all this requires strong Jewish education, both for adults and children. If we don't emphasize Jewish education in all its facets, we will assimilate. So we need to educate our people in what it is, because the other culture is more pervasive, certainly in the diaspora. So it educates easily. We have to work hard to educate both adults and children. He emphasizes adult education a lot, and he says maybe we should be spending, at some point, maybe we should be spending all our money on adult education, not on children's education, because if the parents don't care, the children, no matter what you do for the children, they're not going to care. If the parents are dropping their kids off at Sunday school, but really don't care at all, you're not going to get the children. But if you can educate the adults, they'll figure out how to educate their own children independently. Interesting thought that he had. It requires a democratic participatory framework, and all this depends on a vibrant and dynamic and modern Jewish center in Eretz Yisrael. So he doesn't believe, he believes that we do need a strong center in the land of Israel, as an engine, as a cultural engine, and as a motivating factor for world Jewry. So he doesn't believe, that's his Zionism, which we'll get to in a little bit. I don't know if he called himself a cultural Zionist, but he would definitely very much identifies with Achad Ha'am, who is called nowadays a cultural Zionist. He was unusual, again, in the 20s, 30s, 40s. Zionism was not a popular movement among American Jews. It was a minority movement. Kaplan was very strong in supporting Zionism, in saying that Jews should support the Yishuv and visit Israel and learn Hebrew and all those kinds of things, which was a minority opinion before 1948 among American Jews. But he was a cultural Zionist. He thought that what was important about Israel was promoting Jewish culture, and he was ambivalent about whether we needed a state one way or the other. So again, a quote, Judaism is unlikely to survive unless it will thrive as a primary civilization in Palestine. What he wanted was a strong civilization, a strong culture in Palestine. He didn't really care if it was under the Turks, the British, or it was self-rule. Those were details as far as he was concerned. What was important was that there be Hebrew culture, there be Jewish politics, there be plays, music, all those kind of things coming out of Israel, which would enrich all of world Jewry. And again, another quote which sort of proves the point, and this is from the 50s. So in the 50s, not the 30s, it says after the state of Israel is already alive, he's saying, in contrast to Herzl's conception of the solution to the Jewish problem as one of transportation, in other words, all Jews moving to Israel, we have to see it in light of Achad Ha'am's conception of transformation. The point of Zionism is to transform the Jewish people, to make them proud, to give them a modern culture, not to move all Jews to Israel. And if Jews want to move to Israel, that's okay, it's maybe even a good thing because it'll promote the culture, but the point is the culture. The purpose of Zionism is to renew Jewish culture and reinforce Jewish pride and reinvigorate the Jewish people. A strong Jewish community in the Jewish homeland in Eretz Yisrael is essential to the future survival and growth of the Jewish people. He thought without that motivator, we wouldn't have the oomph, we wouldn't have the pride, frankly, to survive, so he was very strong on that. Before 1948, his view was that a state may or may not be necessary, but in any case, it is only a means to an end. The end is strengthening Jewish culture, Jewish civilization. After 1948, of course, when there is a state, he supports it. The state can and should be a laboratory for trying out Jewish ideas in general, for general social betterment, and for actualizing Jewish ethical principles. So he says, well, this is a great opportunity. Now we can take all our good ideas about justice, about peace, about charity, about all the Jewish values we learn about in the Torah and the Talmud, and we can implement them. It's our chance to do this. We can be a laboratory, and we can try out different methods, and we can come up with good ways of doing it. And that's what sort of his position about Israel after 48. The Jewish people's mission, which is to teach universal brotherhood, can be taken seriously only when it is translated into a definite program, like the abolition of chauvinistic nationalism, the outlawry of war, the establishment of economic justice, or the greater equality of opportunity. Again, writing in the 50s, this is his hope for Israel, that it will be an example to the world, and that's our mission, and if we don't do it, then we're being hypocritical. Other points around it is his view: the Hebrew language should be an international Jewish lingua franca for all, and all Jews should know Hebrew. Very strongly wanted Jews to learn Hebrew, certainly well enough at least to understand the prayers, but hopefully to be able to read Hebrew literature and things coming out of Israel, and perhaps produce Hebrew culture in the diaspora. Israeli cultural production will re-energize Jewish culture in the diaspora. On the other hand, diaspora Jews should actively partake in Israeli culture. He would have approved of Israeli folk dancing and listening to Israeli music and going to seeing Israeli films at the film festival. He thought, yeah, he predicted all this, and he thought that was really a good thing for the Jewish people. Diaspora Jews should be encouraged to live in Israel for at least a few years. He did that himself. He lived there for 2 years in the 30s, or a year and a half in the late 30s. He taught at the Hebrew University. And when he retired in the 60s, he lived there for about 4 years. And I understand that he came back because he was ill. When he sort of came back in the late 60s, he came back to America. His family said, you're getting too old, and we need to take care of you, and we can't take care of you in Israel, so he came back. But he did do what he said there. All diaspora Jews should live in Israel for a few years. That was his idea. People would do that. Diaspora Jews must continue to create and contribute to Jewish culture. So culture is not just coming from Israel to the diaspora, but from the diaspora to Israel and from the diaspora to other diasporas. So cultural production in the diaspora. And diaspora Jews have much to teach Israel, he quotes, says, especially about separation of church and state and religious pluralism. Again, writing in the 50s, he sees the winds going what he thinks is a bad way, and he says, well, Americans have something good to teach them. We can teach them about religious freedom and separation of church and state. Kaplan is critical of normative Zionism. First of all, already in the 30s, he's writing that the Zionists would have been better to seek joint development and Arab cooperation for the Zionist project than to seek great power approval. So, Herzl's idea of Zionism was, I'm going to negotiate with the Sultan. Weizmann's idea of Zionism was, I'm going to get the British to sign a Balfour Declaration for us, and we'll get the British to give us Palestine. And he said, no, what we really need to do is work cooperatively with the Arabs in Palestine, because they're the local people, and we need to convince them. He was he wrote very scathingly against what he called separate development. I don't know if people are familiar with in the 20s and 30s. In order to build up the Jewish Yishuv, there was a whole campaign of Avodah Ivrit, Jewish labor. right? So from the Zionist perspective, we need to employ Jews. From the Arab perspective, it's a boycott. Jews only hire other Jews in Israel. There are posters you can find saying, Avatich Ivri, Kneh Avatich Ivri, buy Jewish watermelons. Well, it doesn't say don't buy Arab watermelons, but that's the effect of it, right? And he thought this, what he called separate development, was a very bad thing and would only antagonize the Arabs, and we need to somehow figure out to work cooperatively with them, and don't count on the great powers to give us the state. Zionists should completely reject Ben-Gurion's call for shlilat hagolah, the negation of the diaspora. So Ben-Gurion believed very strongly and promulgated this in the 50s and 60s when he was an influential person, that the diaspora was dead. There was no future for Jews in the diaspora. It's just an appendage which is slowly going to fade away, and any Jew who wanted to be a Jew should move to Israel. Kaplan thought this was completely wrong and got enraged about this and would write letters to Kaplan, to Ben-Gurion, and to the Zionist Congress saying, how can you do this kind of thing? The diaspora is here to stay and we need to work together for the benefit of the Jewish people. Israel should be a state for all its citizens and not a de jure Jewish state. This is a pretty radical thought, especially nowadays with Prime Minister Netanyahu sort of insisting that the Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state. It has now become a part of Israel's official foreign policy that we be recognized, or Israel be recognized as a Jewish state. He explicitly rejects that. He says minority rights should be sacrosanct in every country, including Israel, and all states, including Israel, should be multinational states. So he certainly would like to have seen Israel have a Jewish majority, but he thought the state cannot, by law, be a Jewish state. It's a multinational state. It serves all its citizens. The fact that most of its citizens are Jews will obviously shift it in a certain way. Most people in Italy are Italians, but they still have to treat non-Italians well, and they can't, treat them badly, and have to give them full legal rights. He thought that Zionism, again in the 50s, was spending too much of its resources on upbuilding of the state and not enough on upbuilding of Jewish culture, both in Eretz Yisrael and the diaspora. Again, perhaps a bit naive. It needed to build up the state in the 50s, but he thought, making the emphasis of Zionism as opposed to the state of Israel, building more roads and stuff was wrong. The emphasis of Zionism should be opening more Hebrew schools, both in Israel and around the world, and teaching Jewish culture. Zionism should encourage the renewal of Jewish ethical religion and not materialistic secularism. So what we want to be proud of in Israel and in Zionism is that Israel is an ethical state, not necessarily that we build good cell phones. Okay, so that, just where the emphasis should be. As currently misunderstood, because he believed, everyone's wrong, just he's right, Zionism and Israel are increasing Jewish chauvinism, which he worried very much about. In the same vein, Zionism should work to have the state of Israel be the first state to subordinate its narrow interests to the interests of mankind. Again, perhaps a little, not a little, certainly quite idealistic, but he thought Israel should declare, we are working for the benefit of all mankind, and we will give up certain things in order to benefit humanity. He was definitely against nuclear weapons. I think he would have been aghast about Israel's nuclear program. It should be a state built on spirit and not on military force, and that's almost a quote. I mean, again, perhaps very idealistic, but that's what he thought. It should embrace and seek to strengthen international law and world government. So rather than be in conflict with the United Nations all the time, he thought we should strengthen that, we should use that, we should try to get international guarantees for Israel's survival and things like that. Jews and Zionism should be attached to the state of Israel as a Jewish homeland, but the state must not privilege Jews or Zionism. So Jews have an obligation to the state of Israel, to the people of Israel, to the land of Israel, but the state has to be neutral, because it's a state. And if we want America to treat Jews well, we can't privilege Jews in Israel, or if we want France to treat Jews well, or something like that. And a few quotes in the same vein. The real Zionist platform is not the one formulated at Basel, in the Basel program, which was the first Zionist Congress, Herzl's program, but the prayer in our ritual, which reads, "Let our eyes behold thy, not our, return to Zion." So Zionism will be fulfilled when justice rules in Jerusalem, not when Jews rule in Jerusalem. Hopefully when Jews rule with justice in Jerusalem together, but, in other words, the emphasis isn't on just moving people there. The emphasis is on the quality of life and the sort of religious religious, spiritual, ethical life that he hoped. And he wrote that in 1909, by the way. The Jewish people must become a world religious community, and by this I think he means just a synonym for a people. And the state of Israel cannot be the authoritative head of the Jewish people. As a modern state, it should not be committed to any particular religion. All citizens of the state, regardless of race, color, or creed, must be accorded equal treatment. The state of Israel offers the Jewish people the unprecedented opportunity to be the vanguard of democracy. So he's not only critical, he's also hopeful that Israel can be a real, show people how it's done properly. If Zionism is to represent something more human and spiritual than an elemental struggle for survival, or the upsurge of nationalism, which is now threatening to drown the world in blood, then it must come to possess the messianic land as portrayed by Isaiah and Micah. So again, very idealistic, but you know, he's writing this in the 50s and he's getting out there and haranguing. He really wants this to happen. So summing up his whole idea of peoplehood, a couple of slides. Peoplehood involves cross-border, multi-state bonds based on history, culture, concern, and care. So a people is a world community. It doesn't live in one country. And what ties it together is culture and history and concern, not flag patriotism and, you know, coercive state laws. So again, it doesn't just apply to Jews. He has this vision that maybe Hindus would feel this way, or Ukrainians, or whatever, you know. Peoplehood is necessary for both the collective and individual salvation. So peoplehood is natural. You can't get rid of it. It's going to exist anyway. People feel these bonds of culture, and they're going to feel close to people who are culturally similar to them and share history and share culture. Peoplehood can be as much a source of transcendental experience as religion, and indeed religion and peoplehood are tightly linked. For him, peoplehood, civilization, religion are sort of a triad. They sort of go together. Peoplehood must be based on a strong foundation of ethics and tolerance and must reject chauvinism. For him, that's just a practical truth. If we don't do that, the world will end. We will kill each other, or we will fail to cooperate in such a way that the world will destroy itself with other forces. And peoplehood is not the same as nationalism. Again, that's why he changed the word. Specifically about Jewish peoplehood, peoplehood is the foundation of Jewish existence. So in Kaplan's worldview, the people created the religion and the civilization, and that religion and civilization create the idea of God. That's sort of the order of how things work. This is the exact opposite of what I was taught in Hebrew school. God gave us the Torah, which is the Jewish religion, and the commandments, and that is what has made the Jewish people what it is today. And he turns that completely on its head. Right? But all this requires a vibrant center in Israel and a vibrant diaspora. He wants them both to be vibrant and to interact with each other. Both must be rooted in Jewish ethics and culture, otherwise known as Judaism. Again, Judaism is the religious civilization of the Jewish people. So both must be rooted in Judaism. Both must meet real needs, spiritual and material, of the Jewish people. Again, he thinks spiritual needs are real. People want to feel uplifted. They want to feel bonds of community and friendship, and they want to feel mutual support. So spiritual needs are real. People want to feel uplifted, and they have material needs. You know, again, we should help poor Jews. We should help, you know, each other in material ways of Jewish people. Both must be inclusive, pluralistic, and democratic, both Israel and the diaspora. Both must take the best from world civilizations. He was in favor of borrowing things from other cultures. He speaks positively of that. He said, they'll borrow from us, we'll borrow from them. What's wrong with that? That's okay. Both must be in concert with and promote the needs of humanity as a whole. If you're not in concert with sort of universal values and what the world needs, you're going to be pushed off to the side. Eventually, you'll shrivel up and die, because in the end, humanity's needs are more important than yours. So your own members will leave you if you don't do that. And that's it.